There is a moment when you stop checking your phone, not because you're strong, but because something in you finally understands no one is coming. There is a moment when abandonment is no longer a fear, but a fact, and it arrives without warning. Not through dramatic rejection, but through absence, messages unanswered, promises quietly dissolved. Support that once felt stable slowly evaporates. At first, the mind refuses to register it. It searches for explanations, excuses, alternate timelines, where things return to how they were. But beneath that mental noise, something colder begins to settle in the realization that what you relied on was never anchored. This shock does not come from being disliked or betrayed. It comes from discovering that your sense of safety was outsourced, that parts of your identity were built on the assumption that someone else would remain present, attentive, available. When that assumption collapses, it exposes how much of the self was organized around external reassurance. Psychologically, this moment fractures the internal order. The roles you played protected, valued, chosen lose their structure. Without witnesses, those roles dissolve, and what remains feels unfamiliar, stripped, and vulnerable. This is why abandonment feels like more than loss. It feels like disorientation. The internal compass spins because it was calibrated to someone else's presence. Most people interpret this shock as proof of personal failure. They assume abandonment means deficiency, that something essential was lacking. But this conclusion is a defense against a deeper truth. The real threat is not rejection, it is independence. To accept that no one is coming means accepting that responsibility can no longer be deferred. There is no one left to blame, lean on, or wait for. This realization provokes panic because it activates a primitive fear, survival without attachment. The psyche equates isolation with danger. Historically, being alone meant exposure. But psychologically, modern abandonment threatens something different. It threatens the illusion that life will arrange itself through others. When that illusion dies, the ego resists fiercely. It reaches outward compulsively, seeking replacement figures, distractions, anything to restore the old equilibrium. People often rush into shallow connections or numbing routines, not out of desire, but out of terror of standing alone with their own unmediated thoughts. Silence becomes unbearable because it reflects back unanswered questions. Yet this shock also reveals something crucial. It exposes where strength has not yet been built. Wherever abandonment hurts most intensely, dependency has taken root. This is not a moral failure. It is a developmental one. Certain capacities were never demanded because support arrived before necessity forced growth. The shock then is corrective. It forces the psyche into confrontation with itself. Without external validation, motivation must be redefined. Without encouragement, action must originate internally. This is where many collapse, mistaking discomfort for danger. But discomfort here is a signal of reorganization, not destruction. In the absence of support, internal dialogue becomes louder. Doubt surfaces. Resentment appears. Old fears demand attention. These elements were always present but muted by noise and reassurance. Now they step forward, asking to be integrated rather than avoided. The shock of abandonment is the psyche insisting on wholeness instead of dependence. There is also grief in this process, not just for people lost, but for an early version of the self that believed effort would always be met halfway. Letting go of that belief feels like betrayal of innocence. But innocence is not strength. It is vulnerability without awareness. As the shock deepens, perception changes. The individual becomes more observant, less reactive. Emotional energy that once flowed outward begins to turn inward. This is not withdrawal, it is consolidation. Attention sharpens, priorities simplify. The need to be understood fades, replaced by the need to be aligned. At this stage, abandonment stops feeling personal and starts feeling structural. It becomes clear that certain supports disappear not because you are unworthy, but because a previous way of being has reached its limit. What once sustained you can no longer accompany you forward. The shock is not meant to be soothed. It is meant to be endured long enough for something sturdier to emerge. A self that no longer negotiates its actions through approval. A self capable of choosing direction without consensus. A self that does not confuse presence with purpose. What feels like being left behind is often the psyche stepping ahead of its old dependencies, demanding a new center of gravity, one that does not collapse when others withdraw, one that does not wait for permission to move, one that begins to act, not because it is supported, but because it is necessary. The most dangerous illusion isn't fear. It's the quiet belief that someone will eventually save you from becoming who you must be. The rescue fantasy begins quietly. It does not announce itself as weakness. It disguises itself as hope. The belief that someone will arrive with clarity, direction, or relief feels natural, even healthy. From early life onward, help often does come. Authority figures intervene, guidance appears, and crises are softened by external hands. Over time, this pattern forms an expectation. When things become unbearable, something or someone will step in. This expectation shapes the psyche more deeply than most realize. Decisions are postponed. Risks are diluted. Responsibility is unconsciously deferred to the future moment when rescue occurs. The individual continues moving, but always with one eye turned outward, scanning for confirmation, permission, or salvation. The fantasy persists because it works until it doesn't. Its death is not dramatic. No rescuer announces their absence. The fantasy collapses through repetition. Unanswered needs, unresolved struggles, delayed breakthroughs. Slowly, the pattern reveals itself. The help that once arrived no longer does. The same coping strategies fail. The same appeals fall into silence. What once felt like patience now feels like stagnation. Psychologically, this is a critical rupture. The rescue fantasy is not merely about other people. It is an internal structure. It is the belief that responsibility can remain partial, that growth can be negotiated, that pain can be bypassed through timing rather than transformation. When this structure collapses, the psyche loses a central organizing principle. This loss produces anger before clarity. Resentment surfaces toward those who did not show up, toward systems that failed to reward effort, toward life itself. But beneath that anger is grief. Grief for the belief that struggle had a shortcut. Grief for the version of the self that expected fairness to substitute for agency. Many people attempt to revive the fantasy in new forms. They chase mentors, relationships, ideologies, or identities that promise guidance without self-confrontation. The language changes, but the structure remains the same. As long as someone else is imagined as the source of resolution, inner authority remains undeveloped. The death of the rescuer fantasy forces a reckoning. Without an imagined savior, the psyche is confronted with its own unfinished capacities. Skills once avoided must now be learned. Decisions once postponed must now be made. The individual realizes that no one is monitoring their potential, no one is tracking their effort, no one is coming to correct their trajectory. This realization is destabilizing because it removes the safety net of excuse. Failure can no longer be blamed on lack of support. Success can no longer be attributed to luck or timing. Everything begins to point inward. This is where many retreat because full responsibility feels heavier than helplessness. Yet this weight is precisely what transforms. The psyche reorganizes around necessity. Action becomes less performative and more deliberate. Choices are no longer framed around approval, but around consequence. The individual begins to experience a new form of seriousness, one rooted in authorship rather than expectation. The death of the rescuer fantasy also dismantles moral bargaining. The belief that being good, patient, or loyal will eventually be rewarded loses its grip. Life is no longer transaction. Effort is no longer offered in exchange for future relief. It is offered because it must be. This shift alters perception of time. Waiting collapses. Urgency replaces hope. Not a frantic urgency, but a grounded one, the awareness that delay itself is a choice with consequences. The individual stops interpreting suffering as a signal to pause and starts interpreting it as a signal to adapt. As this adaptation deepens, self-trust begins to form. Not confidence, but reliability. The individual learns that they can endure confusion, survive disappointment, and act without reassurance. This trust is built slowly through repeated encounters with uncertainty that are no longer outsourced to imaginary saviors. The rescuer fantasy does not die all at once. It fades in layers, retreating each time reality refuses to cooperate. And with each retreat, something sturdier takes its place. A sense of inner containment, a willingness to face discomfort without dramatizing it, a capacity to move forward without guarantees. What replaces the fantasy is not isolation, but sovereignty. The individual no longer waits to be chosen, saved, or directed. They become the source of direction. They stop mistaking longing for guidance as wisdom and begin recognizing it as avoidance. The death of the rescuer fantasy marks the end of childhood at the psychological level. Not the loss of hope, but the loss of dependency disguised as hope. What remains is not despair, but a sharpened awareness of agency, a grounded acceptance of uncertainty, and a self that no longer asks who will save them, because it has learned how to stand without being rescued. Loneliness isn't a punishment. It's a test designed to expose whether you can stand in your own presence without collapsing. Loneliness is often mistaken for a mere emotional state, a temporary discomfort to be avoided or alleviated. People treat it as something passive, a void to be filled, a signal to call a friend, to scroll through social media, or to distract themselves from the knowing absence of connection. Yet, loneliness is far more than discomfort. It is a threshold, a psychological boundary that tests the integrity of the self, a crucible in which the unexamined mind is exposed. At first, loneliness feels like deprivation. It is quiet and invisible, making it easy to rationalize, to ignore, to postpone confronting. The mind searches for reasons, circumstances, timing, others' behavior. But beneath the surface lies the deeper truth. The loneliness you feel is the mirror of your inner incompleteness. It is the psyche signaling that you have been outsourcing your grounding to external sources, approval, companionship, affirmation, and that those sources are no longer reliable. Crossing this threshold is unsettling because it forces confrontation with aspects of the self that have long been ignored. It is here that fear, doubt, inadequacy, and shame surface not as intruders, but as neglected residents of the inner world. They are uncomfortable because they demand acknowledgement. In the presence of others, these parts could be masked, redirected, or softened through interaction. Alone, there is no escape from their scrutiny. Many try to bypass this stage, to fill it with distraction, excitement, or noise. Loneliness becomes medicated through endless activity, social feeds, or addictive behaviors. But these are temporary shields, incapable of substituting the experience itself. The threshold persists, insistent, until it is faced. To cross it is not to endure isolation passively, but to recognize the necessity of being alone with one's own psyche fully and uncompromisingly. The threshold of loneliness is paradoxical. It is painful precisely because it isolates, but it is essential for growth because it forces the individual to confront internal truth. Without it, self-knowledge remains shallow, dependent on the reflection of others. Patterns, fears, and unresolved conflicts continue to operate beneath awareness. Loneliness, when engaged rather than avoided, reveals these hidden dynamics. It becomes a teacher, not a curse. Psychologically, the threshold acts as a filter. Some retreat, refusing the confrontation, returning to comfort, distraction, or dependency. Others endure and begin to develop capacities that only emerge in solitude, clarity of thought, emotional self-regulation, and the ability to act without external reinforcement. The difference between those who retreat and those who endure lies in recognition. The threshold is not something to escape, but a gate to inner autonomy. In this crucible, the individual encounters the unvarnished self. Needs, desires, fears, and values, long hidden beneath social conditioning or dependency, come forward with intensity. The mind may resist, attempting to rationalize or minimize, but the persistence of loneliness leaves no room for avoidance. Here, introspection is forced, reflection is inevitable, and self-dialogue becomes unavoidable. As the threshold is faced repeatedly, something shifts. Awareness deepens. Choices that were previously reactive, based on expectation or validation, become deliberate. Action arises from internal authority rather than from the approval of others. Emotional resilience strengthens, not through external support, but through the disciplined confrontation of discomfort. Loneliness teaches endurance, precision of thought, and the capacity to be present with oneself, unmediated. The threshold also fosters a reconfiguration of relationships. When one has navigated the intensity of loneliness and returned with clarity, the dependency on others for validation diminishes. The connections that were previously superficial are seen more clearly, revealing which are genuine and which were sustained only by projection. The individual no longer seeks to fill a void externally, but to engage from a place of completeness, unpressured, unneedy, and self-responsible. Moreover, loneliness sharpens perception of the world and oneself. In solitude, distractions fall away. Decisions, values, and priorities are illuminated. What was once obscured by noise habits, attachments, and illusions becomes visible. The individual begins to act with intentionality, choosing paths that align with inner truth rather than societal expectation. Yet, the psychological threshold is not a one-time event, it is recurrent. Each encounter with profound solitude offers the chance to revisit unresolved tensions, to refine understanding, and to reinforce inner stability. Loneliness, when treated as a teacher, is never exhausted. It continually tests boundaries, measures resilience, and catalyzes the development of capacities that cannot arise in comfort or constant social mediation. The threshold of loneliness, therefore, is not merely an experience to be endured. It is a structural mechanism of the psyche. It separates those who depend on external validation from those who cultivate inner authority. It demands engagement, introspection, and confrontation with the unacknowledged self. In this space, the individual either turns away, retreating into dependence, or crosses the threshold, emerging with a clarity, autonomy, and depth that cannot be gained through companionship alone. The day no one shows up is the day something ancient inside you asks a terrifying question. If I don't lead myself, who will? Inner authority is not granted. It is not discovered in others, taught in books, or inherited from lineage. It is forged through confrontation with oneself, a result of enduring the moments where no external guide is available, no mentor intervenes, and no reassurance is offered. It emerges in the silence after dependence collapses, in the tension between fear and responsibility, in the space where choice is no longer mediated by approval or validation. This emergence begins with recognition. The individual must first acknowledge the absence of guidance and the unreliability of external support. It is a stark moment, a pause in which all familiar safety nets are revealed as illusion. The mind may resist, seeking excuses, blaming circumstances, or longing for intervention. Yet, inner authority cannot arise in the presence of denial. It requires seeing clearly that the responsibility for movement, decision, and survival rests solely within. Psychologically, this recognition is transformative because it disrupts habitual reliance. For years, many structure their behavior around expectation, reward, and feedback. Decisions are filtered through others' judgments, actions are calibrated to approval, and growth is postponed until reinforcement arrives. When these scaffolds are removed, the individual faces a raw imperative: act or remain stagnant. In that confrontation, a latent capacity begins to awaken, the capacity to self-direct, to self-regulate, and to generate standards that are not contingent upon external validation. The process is not linear. Fear accompanies authority at every step. Acting without permission triggers anxiety, doubt, and the temptation to retreat. Every choice carries weight because there is no one else to share the consequences. Early exercises in autonomy often feel clumsy, unsteady, or morally uncertain. The individual tests limits, makes mistakes, and experiences the unbuffered results of decisions. Each encounter reinforces the understanding that authority is internal. Every failure teaches that reliance on others is optional, not essential. This birth of authority also restructures time and attention. Previously, energy might have flowed outward, spent maintaining relationships, seeking recognition, or negotiating influence. Now, focus turns inward toward discernment and intentionality. Priorities are reassessed. Impulses are observed rather than followed. Action becomes a measured response, informed by values, self-knowledge, and situational awareness. The individual develops a capacity to act decisively, not because someone is watching or guiding, but because alignment with inner principles demands it. Emotional regulation is another critical outcome. Where dependence once amplified fear and magnified insecurity, inner authority stabilizes the psyche. The individual begins to tolerate discomfort, ambivalence, and uncertainty without panic. Loneliness is endured rather than escaped. Frustration is observed rather than reacted to. This internal stability is not innate. It is cultivated through repeated engagement with circumstances that previously would have triggered avoidance or projection. Decision-making evolves from reaction to principle. With external rescues absent, each choice becomes a test of alignment with internal standards rather than a measure of social acceptability. The individual recognizes the cost of inaction and the consequences of compromise. As inner authority consolidates, ethical discernment, practical judgment, and personal responsibility sharpen. The self no longer negotiates existence through borrowed authority, but moves in accordance with an internally verified framework. The development of inner authority also reconfigures relationships. Dependence on approval diminishes and interactions become less about validation and more about genuine engagement. People who were once sources of guidance or rescue are now collaborators, not crutches. The individual's presence no longer fluctuates with others' attention. It is steady, autonomous, and rooted in self-determined purpose. This recalibration of relational dynamics reinforces the authority already established, creating a feedback loop between internal sovereignty and external interaction. Importantly, inner authority does not eradicate vulnerability. It does not eliminate fear, doubt, or the need for reflection. Rather, it allows these elements to exist without commandeering behavior. The individual learns to tolerate uncertainty, engage with difficulty, and act decisively despite incomplete information. The authority is not rigid domination over the self, it is flexible mastery, a capacity to navigate complexity without losing composure or direction. The birth of inner authority, therefore, is both a psychological achievement and a practical necessity. It emerges from the absence of external rescue, the confrontation with responsibility, and the disciplined integration of internal capacities. It transforms the individual from a dependent actor into an autonomous agent capable of navigating life without waiting for approval, guidance, or intervention. Decisions, action, and self-regulation become internally grounded, and the psyche gains a resilience that cannot be borrowed or outsourced. As the process unfolds, the individual becomes increasingly capable of creating structure, setting boundaries, and initiating change from within. Every act of self-direction, no matter how small, reinforces the authority. Each challenge faced independently strengthens the capacity to act decisively. The inner voice of guidance grows clearer, more confident, and increasingly trusted. Where uncertainty once elicited paralysis, it now provokes measured engagement, and where fear once dictated retreat, it now informs strategy. You don't rise when help arrives. You rise the moment you realize you were waiting for yourself the entire time. There comes a moment in life when the realization strikes with undeniable clarity. The person you have been waiting for, the guide, the savior, the steady hand in chaos was never coming. No mentor, no friend, no system, no circumstance will arrive to complete what has been left unwon within yourself. This is not a moment of despair, but a call to action, a challenge issued directly to the self, demanding the emergence of someone capable of bridging the gap that others could not, and that you have long ignored. The first step in becoming the one who was missing is acknowledgement. It requires the brutal honesty to see that external support, while helpful, is unreliable by design. Waiting for it is not merely futile, it is a postponement of growth. The psyche resists this truth, clinging to hope, imagining that someone will appear at the right time to make the path easier. But dependence is a trap. Every delay reinforces patterns of avoidance and diminishes the capacity to act independently. The moment of recognition is a psychological pivot, accepting that the solution resides not in others, but in oneself. This process begins with responsibility. Responsibility is not an abstract notion. It is the recognition that your life, choices, and growth are no longer contingent on external affirmation. You must act without reassurance. You must navigate uncertainty without someone to steady your hand. It is uncomfortable because it exposes the gaps in skill, knowledge, and resilience. The void that was once filled by guidance now presses insistently, demanding confrontation with unfinished parts of the self. Psychologically, this is transformative because it forces integration, abandoned capacities, strength, clarity, discipline, discernment that were previously deferred are now required. Acting in the absence of validation cultivates inner authority, the capacity to self-direct, and the ability to rely on judgment and intuition. This is the crucible in which autonomy is forged. Each decision made, each challenge faced alone, strengthens the emerging self, the one who stepped into the role previously left vacant. The birth of this self is marked by discipline. Not the externally imposed routines dictated by authority, but self-generated structures of consistency and commitment. When no one is coming, habit, focus, and rigor become the scaffolding for survival and growth. Daily choices are no longer trivial. They are tests of integrity and alignment with internal standards. The absence of oversight sharpens attention, transforming tasks into exercises in self-reliance and mastery. Emotional regulation becomes central in this process. Without others to buffer, soothe, or validate, the individual encounters raw feelings with intensity. Fear, doubt, frustration, and grief are no longer moderated by external reassurance. Instead, they are acknowledged, observed, and acted upon strategically. This engagement with the full spectrum of emotions strengthens resilience, creating a foundation of stability that no external force can replicate. Another critical component is clarity of purpose. Waiting for someone else often blurs vision, as actions are guided by the imagined approval or direction of another. Once the vacancy is recognized, priorities crystallize. The self begins to act with intentionality, guided by internal principles rather than external expectation. This is the stage where authenticity emerges, where decisions and actions align with intrinsic values rather than the perceived preferences of others. The process also reshapes relationships. The one who becomes their own rescuer no longer seeks validation to the same degree. Connections are recalibrated, some deepen because they resonate with the emerging autonomy, while others fade because they were sustained by dependency. Presence becomes grounded and deliberate. The individual engages fully, not from lack, but from completeness. The emergence of this self also transforms perception of challenges. Obstacles no longer feel like interruptions or evidence of failure, but as opportunity to exercise agency and build capacity. The individual learns that waiting for someone else only prolongs stagnation, and that action, even imperfect action, produces growth and clarity. Mistakes become lessons rather than crises, and setbacks are absorbed rather than amplified by the absence of guidance. Mentally, this stage cultivates foresight and anticipation. The individual begins to plan, to strategize, and to navigate life with an internalized sense of responsibility. Decisions are informed by both past experience and an internal framework of standards and principles. The capacity for delayed gratification, patience, and disciplined action is strengthened because the self becomes the primary authority rather than relying on external prompts or interventions. Ultimately, becoming the one who was missing is a process of transformation, the psychological ascent from dependency to self-sufficiency. It is not an easy path. It demands confrontation with fear, grief, and inadequacy, It requires persistence, self-discipline, and relentless honesty. But within this process lies the emergence of a self that is capable, autonomous, and resilient, a self that can navigate the world without waiting, without hesitation, and without the crutch of external rescue. Every act of self-initiation, every decision made in absence, every fear endured alone, strengthens this self. Each moment reinforces the internal scaffolding, builds authority, and deepens the capacity to act decisively. The one who was missing is not a mythical figure to be discovered, it is the individual who chooses, acts, and grows in the vacuum left by absence.